Hello, my name is Austin Habish, the founder of Think Catholic, and you're listening to the Summa podcast, where we study St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae in a way simple and insightful for anyone to understand. The Summa podcast is brought to you by Think Catholic. Taking 2 questions of the Summa a day, we'll seek to summarize St. Thomas's responses, discovering the brilliance of Aquinas and his Catholic faith. This is day 61, so let's get started. We're covering today question 119 of the Prima Pars, our last question of the first volume of the Summa, and question 1 of the Prima Secundae, the second volume of the Summa. The questions are of the propagation of man as to the body and of man's last end. The translation that I always use in these podcasts is the one generously provided to me by Ave Maria Press, the 5-volume set translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province, which you can now get at a discounted price from Ave Maria Press's site by typing in the code SUMMA10. And so here we go. Article 1, whether any part of the food is changed into true human nature. Do we transform food into ourselves? Remember, like all other material things, we consist of form and matter, and since the food we are eating has its own form, matter, composition before we eat it, how does it lose its old form and then begin to be informed by our very own? And the perfect analogy here of material becoming or assisting some other form would be in the case of fire. Aquinas writes, when matter is transformed into a fire already existing, then fire is said to be fed. While one piece of wood is burning, other wood is laid on, and so on until the first piece is entirely consumed, and the same identical fire will remain all the time, because that which is added passes into what pre-existed. It is the same with living bodies, in which by means of nourishment, that is renewed, which was consumed. So our form of the body, the soul, which is informing our particular material, begins to inform the food our body digests when it becomes part of us, analogous to the one flame imparting itself to the new logs we place on it and are consumed by it. Article 2, whether the semen is produced from surplus food. I promise, according to my understanding, this will be the last time we see a question like this. And both the question and its response are placed here because of the opinion of Aristotle. And so I think the takeaway from this article and the above one is that since it is clear from the entire first volume of the Summa that we are a form-matter composite, we do have reason to be curious and inquire into how, on the one hand, the material of food comes to take on our own form, and on the other hand, the material of irrational animals in reproduction is able to bestow a form onto this new additional existing animal. And with that being said, and referring to the listener to this article, if they want to learn more about these ancient thoughts concerning biology and their conclusions, we will move on with gratitude and eagerness in our hearts, at least in my heart, to the second volume of the Summa. Beginning with the prologue from St. Thomas, he writes, since as Damascene states, man is said to be made in God's image, insofar as the image implies an intelligent being endowed with free will and self-movement, now that we have treated of the exemplar, i.e. God, and of those things which came forth from the power of God in accordance with his will, it remains for us to treat of his image, i.e. man, inasmuch as he too is the principle of his actions as having free will and control of his actions. And without further ado, we begin this second volume of the Summa with question 1 on man's last end. Article 1, whether it belongs to man to act for an end. In this article and in the ones that follow, end means goal. So we could rephrase the question to ask whether it belongs to man to act for some goal. When you act, is it for the sake of some goal? Well, why are you listening to this podcast right now? Take a moment and think about what goal you had in mind before you hit play. And I think given enough time and introspection, you would find some goal in mind, even if it was just to burn time, as the saying goes. Every action that we undertake that is voluntary, we do for the sake of some goal. These are called properly human actions. Now, when your heart beats or you flinch at an object flying towards you, these are not voluntary actions, But that doesn't mean that they didn't have some end or goal determining them. The heart beats because that is its end or purpose written into our nature, into its nature for it to do. Your instinct into self-preservation is another goal written into your nature. Whether voluntary or involuntary, material or immaterial, nothing in the whole created universe moves if not for some end or goal. The only difference is that some things move rationally while other things move irrationally. And we have no less than 8 articles in this question to flesh that out, but for the sake of this article, it is simply worth citing and explaining the following words from Aquinas. The object of the will is the end, just as the object of sight is color. So just as our will, our power to will is necessarily directed towards willing goods, either as a means or an end, so too sight is necessarily and naturally directed toward apprehending color. We do not see anything unless it is colored, and we do not will anything unless it is our goal or it is a means to that goal. Either way, the answer to this article is in the affirmative. It does belong to man to act for an end. Article 2, whether it is proper to the rational nature to act for an end. Is it only the rational, voluntary creature that acts with some goal or end present at its beginning, in it at the beginning? The answer, as all nature testifies, is in the negative. Everything, as we have said in previous episodes, has the 3 P's, or perfection, preservation, propagation, if it can propagate, written into its nature as goals and ends. And this because the author of nature is intelligent, all-powerful, omnibenevolent. And so it is fitting for him to order all things towards their own good. That is why inanimate things which cannot think pursue the good of unity via gravitational motion, and by taking the most efficient path to get there, what physicists call the path of least action. It is why the bee, which also cannot think, builds hexagonal honeycomb cells so as to hold the maximum amount of honey for the least amount of wax. It is also why the lamb, which cannot think, runs from the wolf via innate natural judgments which go beyond the external senses of the thing, all the way to judging things it has never seen to be useful or harmful to it. The entire created world pursues perfection, preservation, and propagation naturally, and in the manner in which they exist, either as non-living or living, as irrational or as rational. Article 3, whether human acts are specified by their end. Since we don't act in general, I've never walked in general or eaten food in general, but we eat specific foods or we walk in specific directions. What is the cause of the specificity of our actions? Why I decided to walk in this specific direction, or why I chose this specific item from the food menu. And Aquinas, repeating in a way what we've said already, tells us that it is the specific goal we have in mind, which is determining the specific direction of our walking or the specific choice we have on the menu. St. Thomas will also add that this goal is also where our actions, ordinarily speaking, receive their moral character. That besides things like adultery, which are always wrong no matter what goal was intended in the undertaking of it, the vast majority of our actions are good or evil based on the intended goal. For example, and this is Aquinas' example, this act to kill a man, which is but one act in respect of its natural species, can be ordained as to an end, to the safeguarding of justice, and to the satisfying of anger. In one way, there will be an act of virtue, in another, an act of vice. Article 4, whether there is one last end of human life. This is in a way the flip side of Aristotle's unmoved mover argument, which we discussed in episode 2. that for my hand to go from potentially moving to actually moving, my muscles have to go from potentially contracting to actually contracting. But before that, some series of motor neurons have to go from potentially firing to actually firing, and so on, until we get to some first cause of this entire series, which is just actuality, complete act itself, namely God. And the series has to terminate in some way in this first cause, because every link in the chain is instantaneously dependent on something above it or before it. And if that just goes on forever, there would be no series in the same way, but looked at from a different aspect, from the aspect of final cause instead of efficient cause. We cannot have means or middle goals which are for the sake of some end without the end itself existing. So that if there is no last end intended in our actions, there will be no means either, and therefore there will be no action at all. So if we are acting, there must be some singular end we are intending, causing the entire chain of means to matter to us. Just like if my hand is moving, there must be some first cause giving actuality to the entire chain, which ends in the movement of my hand. In Aquinas' words, absolutely speaking, it is not possible to proceed indefinitely in whatsoever things there is an essential order of one to another. If the first be removed, those that are ordained to the first must of necessity be removed also. Wherefore the philosopher proves that we cannot proceed to infinitude in causes of movement, because then there would be no first mover, without which neither can the others move, since they move only through being moved by the first mover. In the same way, that which is first in the order of intention, i.e. the goal, is the principle, as it were, moving the appetite. Consequently, if you remove this principle, there will be nothing to move the appetite. And so without one last goal, so go the means, so goes any possibility of voluntary action on behalf of us, the rational agent. Article 5, whether one man can have several last ends. Can a man have several last goals? It's kind of like asking if a chandelier can hang from several various chain links above it. And it can, but eventually it will have to end in something like a ceiling, some one final last thing that is holding the entire link of chains and the chandelier up. As we mentioned, we will things either as a means or as a goal, and without a last goal, there would only be an endless series of means. But means derive their desirability for us or to us only because they help us to some goal. But without that last goal, so go any desirability of the means, which would entail us not willing either the means or the end, therefore not willing at all. In this article, St. Thomas first tells us what he means by a final or last end of the will. He writes, since everything desires its own perfection, a man desires for his ultimate end that which he desires as his perfect and crowning good. Then Aquinas presents his argument for this article, writing, it is therefore necessary for the last end so to fill man's appetite, that nothing is left besides it for man to desire, which is not possible if something else be required for his perfection. Consequently, it is not possible for the appetite so to tend to two things, as though each were its perfect good. So we must have in mind one last perfect end or goal or crowning good in order to make the means desirable for its sake, in order for us to will at all. Article 6, whether man wills all, whatsoever he wills, for the last end. In St. Augustine's words, that is the end of our good, for the sake of which we love other things, whereas we love it for its own sake. And so, yes, we do indeed will everything we do will for the sake of that last thing we take to be our crowning, fulfilling, completely satisfying good. Aquinas, giving us his answer here, also gives us a good summary of what we've covered thus far in writing, man must of necessity desire all, whatsoever he desires, for the last end. This is evident for two reasons. First, because whatever man desires, he desires it under the aspect of good. And if he desire it not as his perfect good, which is the last end, he must of necessity desire it as tending to the perfect good. Every beginning of perfection is ordained to complete perfection, which is achieved through the last end. Secondly, because the last end stands in the same relation in moving the appetite as the first mover in other movements, now it is clear that secondary movers do not move save inasmuch as they are moved by the first mover. Therefore, secondary objects of the appetite do not move the appetite except as ordained or ordered to the first object of the appetite, which is the last end. Article 7, whether all men have the same last end. As St. Augustine wrote, all men agree in desiring the last end, which is happiness. And if you want to practically prove that, not just philosophically, ask your friend or family member a series of questions like, why did you get up this morning? To go to work, maybe they say. But why did you want to go to work? To make money. Why did you want to make money? To live comfortably. And why did you want to live comfortably? Because of some reason, because they want to be happy. And if you ask questions long enough, that is eventually where you will end. All men agree in that they seek happiness as the last goal or end of their actions, but not all men agree on what, in fact, is that thing which can bring us happiness. Bringing these two considerations into one citation, namely, that we all will the same thing, happiness, but we are looking for it in different places. Here is one of my favorite quotes from Blaise Pascal. He wrote, all men seek happiness. There are no exceptions. However different the means they may employ, they all strive towards this goal. The reason why some go to war and some do not is the same desire in both, but interpreted in two different ways. The will never takes the least step except to that end. This is the motive of every action of every man, including those who take their own lives. Yet for very many years, no one without faith has ever reached the goal at which everyone is continuously aiming at. All men complain. Princes, subjects, nobles, commoners, old, young, strong, weak, learned, ignorant, healthy, sick, in every country, at every time, in all ages, and in all conditions. A test which has gone on so long without pause or change really ought to convince us that we are incapable of attaining the good by our own efforts. But example teaches us very little. So while the present never satisfies us, experience deceives us and leads us on from one misfortune to another until death comes as the ultimate and eternal climax. What else does this craving and this helplessness prove but that there was once in man a true happiness, of which all that now remains is the empty print and trace? This he tries in vain to fill with everything around him, seeking in things that are not there the help he cannot find in those that are, but none can help, since this infinite abyss can be filled only with an infinite and immutable object, in other words, by God himself. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. We will leave the discovery of what object can actually bring us happiness for another episode. This article is only asking if we are all indeed pursuing the same thing, and the answer is yes. We are all pursuing happiness. Article 8, and this is our last article, whether other creatures concur in that last end. Are plants and animals also looking for happiness? And the answer we must say is no, because happiness is an intellectual thing. However, all things have the same end, which is God, by being made for him and in pursuing good, which is a semblance of or similar to in some way goodness itself, which is God. St. Thomas responds to this article writing, if therefore we speak of man's last end as of the thing which is the end, thus all other things concur in man's last end, since God is the last end of man and of all other things. If, however, we speak of man's last end as of the acquisition of the end, then irrational creatures do not concur with man in this end. For man and other rational creatures attain to their last end by knowing and loving God. This is not possible to other creatures, which acquire their last end insofar as they share in the divine likeness, inasmuch as they are, or live, or even know. Which brings us to a close of our first episode of the second volume of the Summa. We have just finished covering question 119 of the Prima Pars and question 1 of the Prima Secundae, which are of the propagation of man as to the body and of man's last end. My name is Austin Habish with Think Catholic, and I cannot wait to see you tomorrow.